Hi guys, and welcome to the next episode. So now that I've chosen my dissertation topic, and in case you're wondering, the full title of it is Nozick on Property Rights and Taxation. So a lot of my research and study is going to be focused on that. So I thought it'd be sensible to start a series of basically almost an ode to my dissertation. So I should think a fair few of these episodes, or at least at the start, are going to be focused around Nozick's book, Anarchy, State and Utopia. I'm only about 3 chapters in at the moment, but I want to stress how enjoyable and accessible this book is to read. And honestly, it's pretty funny. So to lay out the nature of his book, he basically starts with the first line of the premise being, humans have rights, and there are things no person or group may do to them without violating their rights. So strong and far-reaching are these rights that they raise the question of what, if anything, the state and its officials may do. End quote. So basically, he lays out the argument into 3 parts. One is saying, well, can we get to a state? And that's the first part of, we go from kind of an anarchistic system to justifying, or kind of justifying, a form of mini-state. And then we get on to what extent can the state be and be justified, which he concludes is very, very small. And then he goes on with quite a romantic look towards utopian thought. But to start, in part 1 of his book, State of Nature Theory, or How to Back into a State Without Really Trying, and yes, it is actually called that, Nozick is trying to kind of justify the state, albeit a very small one by today's standards. He does this by discussing a romanticised state of nature. The concept of state of nature is one that came as the foundation of early modern political philosophy through Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, and has remained quite relevant ever since as kind of the starting block for political thought. In a very broad strokes description, it is essentially the question of what would life be like without the state. Needless to say, though, there's a lot of disagreement between philosophers on this, with Hobbes thinking that it would be nasty, brutish and short. It would be a fight of each against all and we'd all die and it would be terrible. Whereas Rousseau thought it would be amazing and everyone would have fun and enjoy themselves. And Nozick quite artfully just kind of avoids sinking into this messy quagmire by saying, well, let's assume that people will act almost perfectly and take the kind of Lockean approach to the state of nature, which is kind of the most accepted option available when you're looking for a state of nature. And he wants to see if the state can justifiably arise from this. And what's important is if Nozick can justify the state forming within this version where everyone acts almost perfectly, then in all the weaker cases when people are trash, it can also be justified, if not more so. So he's kind of setting his sights high, because if he can hit that, then everything underneath that is also included. So Nozick sets the scene of Locke's state of nature, where people have complete freedom to do what they want with themselves and their property, provided they don't harm another in their life, health, liberty or possessions. Basically, you can't steal or murder, but you can do whatever you want with what you've got, aside from small amounts of messy obligations to God that Locke had. Locke thought you couldn't kill yourself because God actually owned your body, but we'll ignore that. Naturally, though, there must be some means afforded to protecting your rights if someone acts unjustly, such as attacking you. And Locke says this is the place for government. But Nozick worries that Locke kind of jumped the gun a bit here. Nozick wanted to see if he could solve this problem without going straight to a state, if with just the tools that we have available in the state of nature that Locke's given us, and see if we can fix this problem. And then if a state arises through that solution, instead of artificially jumping in with here's a problem, fix it with a state, he's trying to see if the state can arise naturally out of things that aren't the state. So the tools Nozick had available to himself at current are basically individual rights and liberty, property, and voluntary arrangements. And the biggest issue he needed to solve was that in the state of nature, we all had the right to protect our own rights, but these would manifest in kind of an awkward and iffy way just because of the nature of us being individuals. So basically, if someone were to try and steal from me, I'm justified in stopping them stealing from me. The problem is, it gets messy because obviously, if someone were to try to steal from me, I'm probably going to be quite partial to what the just amount of retribution is, quite unfairly in my favour. Likewise the other way, for the person who was committing the crime. So we kind of want a system where we can have a disinterested judge so that we can make sure we actually get the closest to the just amount of retribution as possible. And an even bigger problem is, well, what if someone's just stronger than me? Like, I am by no means 6 foot, and if some 6'4" bodybuilder swaggers on in and takes my phone and walks out, realistically, I can't actually stop him. But we still need to fix this. We can't just have a system that can't solve people who are bigger than me stealing things from me. So Nozick suggests, as a direct solution to these problems, that we can have protective associations. So it's basically the individual version of defensive pacts between nations, in a sense, which essentially goes, well, if someone attacks me, you have to come and help me. But if you agree to this, if someone attacks you, I'll come and help you. And so that just kind of seems to fix the problem, at least briefly. And then Nozick does go on to discuss a lot more intricacies of how do you check that someone isn't falsely accusing someone else to make you go to war all the time to try and protect them when they weren't actually having their rights affronted. And so through problems like that, you would assume that good systems of protective associations would develop a kind of due process of procedure. Else you could be having to fight constantly, or even though you'd agree to it, they could just find a loophole and say they don't want to fight. So for everyone's benefit over time, Nozick takes it as reasonable to assume that a due process would be set. And he basically saw these defensive associations developing into a kind of split between an insurance company and kind of like an army for hire. So they work out who was in the right, and then they carry out the justifiable retribution, whether that be someone stole my phone, so I call them up, they find out that my phone's been stolen, and they go break into that guy's house, take my phone back, and bring it back to me, and that's the end of it. So what's vital is they still can't break the Lockean rules that we'd set out, assuming that everyone acts romantically within the system. So they can't just force people to give them their money. They're only allowed to do it by voluntary action. But there is a concern that Nozick raises that over time, the dominant protective agency would put all others out of business. Since obviously, if the organisations were to disagree on who was guilty, or what the right amount of retribution was, the ensuing conflict would be pretty expensive, considering it would be literal war. But more so, if you're paying someone to protect you, you're not going to pay a company that's not the biggest. Because if there's a company that can beat them up when they disagree, then you paying to be protected by them doesn't actually achieve anything. So then it will kind of create an environment where everyone will flock to the same protective association, since only the biggest one would actually be capable of implementing its judgments. To take a minute to check where we are, we're still in an anarchist, Lockean state of nature, but now we have these protective associations which protect their clients' rights and have a lot more force than the individual. But we don't seem to be that much closer to having an actual state than the anarchist was at the start. But from this point, Nozick thought that the progression of the protective associations would go one of three ways. And these were, firstly, we just spoke about, the strongest association would remove the weaker ones from the market due to their judgment being backed by more force. And over time, this would just lead to a simple monopoly. where there is only one protective association for each area. The second possible solution is that neither of the associations would really win, but they'd be strongest near the focus of their client base. And so over time they would develop geographical centres. And so then almost lines of jurisdiction would end up being drawn, in a sense, of the vast majority of people here are protected by that association because that's where they're based, so to say. So, for example, each village would have an association that works with them because that's where, say, the depot is and the military is. Or the final option is that you could have multiple agencies all set up in the same place, but then if they were to constantly fight and no one was a clear winner, well, it would be such an inefficient system that they'd realise over time it would be far more profitable to every association to have some kind of third-party system of due process to which they all agree to be bound. It's important to remember that Nozick isn't saying that all competition leads to monopoly. He's saying that specifically within the environment of protective associations, that disputes would become so disproportionately expensive. For example, wars are really not cheap. Like, really not cheap. And if you have a system where everyone respects the common law and so the force doesn't need to be implemented, that will be far, far, far more profitable than having to send out your military every time someone disagrees on whose chocolate bar is whose. So it would be far cheaper and more efficient for us to agree to have a system of deciding whose chocolate bar it is, and whatever the decision is, we're all bound to, than to say, well, I'm going to invade you because my client says you stole it, and your association saying, well, I'm going to invade you because my client said you stole it. And so what Nozick shows here is that out of Anarchy, and out of all of the rules that Anarchy gives, it seems reasonable to suppose that this system of protective agencies, whose jurisdiction is bound by geographical location, and are starting to look suspiciously like states in the way they end up having a seeming monopoly on violence, can and conceivably would emerge. It is important to remember, though, this isn't Nozick claiming this is how states emerged or how they actually happened. He's just saying that this system is justifiable and would make sense within an anarchist system. And then Nozick goes on to lament as to whether these dominant protective associations constitute a state. Like, are they just the same as basically what you were trying to get rid of? And if so, then the anarchist argument of states are unjustified doesn't really stand, because we've started from an anarchistic point. We've only made justified moves throughout. And then if we end up with something that's unjustified, that just doesn't make sense. You can't have all your premises be true and your argument be valid, but your conclusion be false and unjustified. You're just not allowed to do that logically. But we're not sure if we actually do get to a state, and this is something that Nozick discusses. So importantly, provided that all the Lockean rules of the state of nature are abided by, then there could still be people living within the geographical jurisdiction of the protective association who don't actually purchase any protection from them. And vitally, the association can't make them. It can't force them to pay to be protected by them. And that's not something that's justifiable with the tools that Nozick's agreed he's going to use. But states often do this. And Nozick realises that there are a couple of intuitive responses to why these protective associations aren't states. The first being that they still allow people to enforce their own rights, and the second being that they don't protect everyone within their domain. And these are things that the state supposedly does do. But to have this conversation, we do need a kind of placeholder term for what a state is or does. So Nozick thinks a good notion for a state, for our current purposes, is that it will punish everyone whom it discovers to have used force without its express permission. And he mentions that he does see flaws in this explanation, but holds that it will do for now. And a key intuitive distinction between the protective associations and the state is that vitally, those who don't pay the protection associates still have the right to judge for themselves whether their rights have been violated, and do still have the right to personally extract revenge or reparations for the actions. Now, realistically, if it was by a member of a protective association, they probably don't have sufficient force to be able to do that. But if it were two individuals outside of the association, then the association would have no interest in the event. So, person A could be stolen from by person B, and then they could go and extract revenge, and the protection association simply wouldn't be interested, or shouldn't be at least. And that's different from a state. And also that only those paying are protected, again. But this has the wider issue of you kind of can't only protect the people that are paying for you in the loosest sense. In the example I gave already of person A stealing from person B, then it's not really a problem. But imagine if there was some Mongol horde invading the whole geographical area around you. If you're a group of houses, you can't really muster an army to fight off the invading forces to protect the houses that have paid for the army without also protecting the houses directly adjacent to them which haven't paid for the army. So you do get this kind of freeloader problem when there's large-scale conflicts. And I think these are the kind of things that Nozick is alluding to when he concludes for Chapter 2 that, quote, "Thus it appears that the dominant protective agency in a territory not only lacks the requisite monopoly over the use of force, but also fails to provide protection for all in its territory, and so the dominant agency appears to fall short of being a state. But these appearances are deceptive." End quote. So in conclusion, we've briskly covered Nozick's first two chapters of Anarchy, State and Utopia, and tried to see if we can get to a justified mini-state purely from agreed upon anarchistic principles. We seem to have somewhat fallen short of that. We don't seem to have got the perfectly justified system that's made a true state. But it also seems that we've got very, very close. So, that concludes my first episode on discussing the research I've done for my dissertation. That was covering the first two chapters of Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia. So if you did enjoy it, or if you have any questions, please do like, comment, subscribe. And as always, thank you very much for listening.